The thing is, there's plenty of foreigners in Japan, but most of them leave, and for good reason. I almost left with them. So if you're interested in figuring out that Japan's not a perfect wonderland, stick around. So if you move to the USA, people will ask where you're from, but they will accept that you are an immigrant in the USA. And your children will not be asked where they're from, because they're from the USA where they were born. The same is true in England, it's true in France, it's true in Sweden, it's true in even Germany, who, let's say, has a history of not so open immigration policies. That's not true in Japan. For some reason, most YouTubers don't talk about this, and I think it's because they'll get disliked by Japanese people so much and by other foreigners who want to think Japan is this perfect wonderland. Japan's amazing. I wouldn't be here if it wasn't, but it's not perfect. And there are some glaring issues that not talking about them is not going to fix them. So the thing is, as much as you move to a developed westernized country, you get to immigrate. You get to be a member of society. People don't ask you, when are you leaving? When are you leaving? And your kids are from that country because they were born there. And not only is that not true in Japan, but it's not even in the law. Like, if I have a child with a Korean here in Japan, that child is not Japanese. You must be genetically Japanese. Now, that being said, if one of us gave up our former passport and became Japanese and then had a child, technically, yes, that would make them Japanese. So they might have my blue eyes or my curly hair. People will ask them where they're from, even though they're a 5-year-old that speaks only Japanese. And I see it happen all the time. I have a friend with a Russian mother and a Japanese father. His mother died when he was 2. He doesn't speak Russian, and he of course doesn't speak English. We've only ever spoken in Japanese, and people are uncomfortable with it. And people ask him where he's from in English. He doesn't know what they're saying, and they cannot figure out why this Japanese man looks like this and doesn't speak English. So the general outline, if you want to skip out here because the video's too long, you will never be Japanese. If you were not born here and don't look like you should have been born here, you'll never be Japanese. You will have to speak some level of English. To be fair, this is more for non-Asian looking people, Westerners. But I have friends that are Chinese genetically and grew up here, or Korean genetically and grew up here. I had no idea they weren't Japanese, but tell you what, all their friends at school or non-friends at school were extremely aware of it. And their work opportunities were extremely aware of it. So Japan, let's call it a bit conservative. A major reason most foreigners leave, and this is from foreigners I've talked to, is job opportunity. Whenever you meet people outside of a major city and you say that you live here, they'll be like, Eigo no sensei, English teacher? And that's really how they talk. And that's what they'll do. They'll feel apologetic for speaking Japanese to you in Japan, even though you were speaking Japanese. But you're an English teacher, because that's what we do. And if you're not an English teacher, they're confused. And the reason is, save Tokyo for later, in Osaka I knew 5 foreigners who didn't teach English. I knew more than 5 foreigners in total. But as far as the Western foreigners not teaching English, 3 own their own business. The other speaks so good that if you close your eyes, you think he's Japanese. He has no accent, no intonation, nothing that would strike him apart from Japanese. And his job is, let's call it, not amazing, but it's not teaching English. It's a programming job for the minimum full-time wage. And his coworkers, let's call it, make more. And the other person I know who does not teach English, he's a translator. The upgrade for the gaijin jobs. It's beyond English teacher, but still English-based. And by the way, English is his second language, Japanese is his third. So Germans, you're not getting away from this either. But getting this job, he'll do his translating, and then they'll have 5 people proofread it, and a separate person who's Japanese do the translation again to make sure they got the same results. And they almost always do, but it's always, oh, you did a good try. From my personal experience, my Japanese is not perfect, but I left Osaka with the same Japanese I arrived in Tokyo with. And tell you what, almost all the jobs that said no to me in Osaka said, no, you're foreign, we can't trust your work quality. Or, no, you're foreign, you don't speak Japanese. And they say that at the end of a 30-minute Japanese interview, where I answer every question, I ask them questions, I'm telling jokes, we're having a good time, but it was all a farce. I didn't actually speak Japanese. I somehow memorized the whole conversation in advance and knew all the questions they would ask and their answers to my question. Now, I don't speak Japanese, and so I couldn't get a job. So job opportunities are really low if you don't look Japanese. That is with the exception of Tokyo, where I live now. And in Tokyo, not only is there an acceptance of foreigners in the workplace, but I haven't met anyone in Tokyo who's asked if I'm an English teacher. That being said, I still got no's from some jobs purely based on my address of birth being not Japan. So if you want to work in Japan and you don't want to teach English, it's possible. I'd recommend staying in Tokyo, but you're gonna have a real uphill battle. And on a tangent from that, the one that bothers me the most is Japanese people not speaking Japanese. Now, you'll see a lot of foreigners saying, oh, that never happens to me. And if it's online, you have to ask them, well, where are you from? And a lot of times, those are Chinese people saying it who knew Japanese before they got here. Or they came here for a specific job that brought them to Japan, and they already spoke Japanese because they were studying it for the job back in the States or wherever they're from. Or they went to university here and they were Japanese students, and so in the university society, they all knew that these were students in Japanese. But even some of the students I know who are studying Japanese, who have their N2, which is like C1 in European standards, they're fluent, not native, but fluent, and they still get people trying to speak to them in English. And they're not from English-speaking countries, and they don't speak English. But you're an English speaker, and you're an English teacher almost all the time. And it's, again, much, much better in Tokyo. But I still get people, when I'm wearing my uniform, that says I work at this custom motorcycle shop, surrounded by Japanese people who are speaking to me in Japanese, they'll try to speak English, and they'll be like, sorry, English, very difficult. And it's like, what are you doing? I'm speaking to you in Japanese. Everyone's speaking to me in Japanese. This is Japan. And then they'll ask, do you work here? And it's like, what do you think? We're wearing matching uniforms. I'm currently welding your bike. And it's like, nah, I just broke in here, stole a uniform, and decided to do unpaid labor. And they'll even say, do you live here? Well, we've already determined I'm speaking Japanese and I'm at work. Who moves to a foreign country with the hardest language on earth, learns it, and then gets an unpaid job for vacation? Who do you think exists in this world? And they really can't handle it. Hello, bicycle friends. But again, that's much less common here in Tokyo. And again, here in Tokyo, almost every job said yes or no based on my Japanese skills and their need for my skill set. It's much less common in the Kanto region that you get turned down purely based on your race. Now, this language issue of people won't speak to you in Japanese because you are Western, I will say, as an American who has lived in Spain and France with British people and Australian people and New Zealanders, and the Canadians who are not from French Canada, who are not from Quebec, the treatment is similar there. Like in Spain, I'm an English teacher, and even though they assume there's plenty of people who don't, it's not like they assume my job as an English teacher. It's just, oh, you're my chance to practice English. No, I'm not. I worked really hard to get this visa. You don't need a visa in England. So go to England if you want to learn. And that argument worked pretty well for a lot of people. But it's far worse here. It's far more dramatic here. Like, there's plenty of people that'll just choose to speak to me in English because I'm from an English-speaking country while in Europe, even if I'm speaking to them in Spanish, but it's not normal, and other Spanish people call them out on it. I've even had a Spanish person call another Spanish person a racist for trying to practice English with me, explaining that I live here, I speak Spanish, I came to learn Spanish, speak Spanish, and then other things that I'm just not going to yell on this channel. But in Japan, most Japanese people will just say, oh no, there's no racism in Japan. No, that would never happen to you in Japan, even though that exact person has done it. Or they've seen it happen to you and look, no, that person's just, well, maybe they're Chinese. It's like, okay, so now you're proving the racism. Of course, my wife sees these things because she's been with me so long that these things have stood out to such an extreme. But that's the thing. Speaking Japanese, learning Japanese, it's very hard in Japan, not because the language is hard. I actually don't find it too much harder to learn than Spanish, forgetting reading and writing, of course, but getting Japanese people to speak Japanese. You make one mistake while speaking Japanese, they'll try to think of the English word. And then sometimes I will lie and say, ごめんなさい、私はスペイン人、英語わかりません. And they'll be like, 大変な. No Spanish. And I have to explain to them, あなたは日本人? そう? Yes, Japanese. 日本語してる? Yes, I speak Japanese. 僕も日本語話して、日本語全然大丈夫. Oh, really? And then they'll keep trying English, and I just have to walk away. And that has never happened to me anywhere outside of Japan. I'll say even in Korea, people got mad at me for not speaking Korean. It's like, I've been here for 6 hours. I'm sorry that I haven't figured it out yet. But that's where Korea felt more like France, in good and bad ways. But yeah, like something that goes off of this is making friends. You will get plenty of friends who speak English if you try really hard. You will get plenty of friends who are also foreign. But getting Japanese friends that speak Japanese to you is very hard to get and very rare. You'll find people that do, but those people came here with a high level of Japanese and work in an all-Japanese setting, which is extremely difficult to get off the bat. Because how do you learn a language that the speakers don't speak to you? And the problem with the people that do learn in school, Japan's not very good at teaching English. What would make you think they're great at teaching Japanese? Your Japanese teacher will say off the bat, you'll never be perfect, so don't even try. And all these people come out with terrible accents. Something my wife hates about me is I sometimes make fun of myself with an American accent. Like, not that I'm perfect at Japanese, but here, I'll say the same sentence twice, and I'm sure you'll get it. 私は海流ライダー、バイク大好き. And most Americans that learn in those school would say, 私は海流rider, バイクが大好き. And it's just so dramatically different. And it's hard not to laugh, even as a fellow American. And it's like, British sounds so fancy and lovely to us, Americans. But when I hear a British accent in Japanese, it gets me a bit cringy. It's like, how have you not had the natural intonation picked up? And it's because they don't have natural conversations ever. It's the same in Spain. The people that learn Spanish in school, they speak with this really American accent. Por ejemplo, yo hablo un buenísimo acento en español, pero mis amigos de los Estados y Canadá hablas con un mal acento. And it's just the difference between learning in school and learning out. But in Spain, those people who learn that way, they slowly lose that accent if they stay in Spain. Here in Japan, many do not lose that accent. Because again, they only use it for work or for moments where they have to, and their social circle doesn't speak Japanese. And that nicely brings us to dating in Japan. You're gonna have a similar issue. What I've noticed is if you're dating a Japanese person, it is a bit gendered, but if you're dating a female in Japan, she has learned English, or you will be teaching her English, no matter how good your Japanese is. And it's somewhat true for the guys, but it's even, I know Chinese people who are married here, and they speak to me in English, but they don't speak very good Japanese. They work for Chinese companies here, and their wives learned Chinese. Their wives learned Mandarin. And it's like, come on. Isn't it easier to just teach foreigners who live here Japanese? Because that's a big reason for divorce here in Japan. The Japanese spouse has to take care of everything. You have to do my taxes. You have to help me apply for work. You have to help me apply for apartments. You have to help me do everything because my Japanese sucks. So wouldn't it have been better to just help with Japanese in the first place? He's in more of a hurry than me right now. This video's got too much reading, I can't go fast today. But wouldn't it have been easier to just teach me Japanese? And obviously no, but in the long term, yes. Like if we're planning the rest of our lives here, or to work with Japanese companies forever, everyone always struggling to pretend they speak English is not a good solution. I will say, I know one person who was dating a Japanese person who I later found out is actually Chinese and has just lived in Japan since she was 10. But she taught him Japanese. She had no interest in English. But that man is now married to a different person who is Japanese, and he has taught her English because that's how that works. And she, like, they mostly speak Japanese together, but she refuses to speak to me in Japanese because, oh, I can't speak to a foreigner in Japanese, they won't understand. It's like, turn to your left and gaze upon your husband who is doing business in Japanese right in front of us. But it does go that deep. And with my personal relationship, on a good day, my wife and I will do about 50-50 Japanese and English. And to be fair, she knew fluent English before we met. She lived in America for a year, and she was actually an English teacher when we met. Not at the same school, it's just a coincidence. Hello, friends. But that's a thing that you see how some of those people waved at me. When I have my clear visor or the visor open, I've noticed some people will start to wave and just make an angry face because, he's not Japanese, I can't wave at him. And again, far less common here in Kanto. But dating in Japan, you should assume you're going to help your partner with your language. It's not impossible that they help you with Japanese, it's just super, super rare. And it's of course harder if they already speak English. Why would we have a crap conversation when we can have an easy, fluent conversation? There's also, when it comes to them helping you out, let's talk about getting apartments, because this is not better in Tokyo from my experience. So, when I applied for apartments where I first lived in Japan, in a small town in Nagano, there was like 50 openings, and my employer was setting it up, and when they then registered my visa, suddenly there were 2 openings. And then on our way to the first place, they were like, sorry, the second place just canceled. I couldn't understand what the real estate guy was saying to my employer, but I heard the word gaijin a lot, so let's assume there was some issues. And in Osaka, there were plenty of places for rent that were not available to me. And in Tokyo, we had the same problem. So in Osaka, the way we solved that problem is my wife, who was my girlfriend at the time, she applied for the apartments for her and her roommate. And so we skated around that. But Tokyo has become privy to that trick. So they said, your roommate, you mean your boyfriend or your husband? It's like, yeah, my husband. And he's Japanese? Well, no. Because we had to register my ID at that point. And a lot of them said no. And a lot of them said, is he Chinese? And I wasn't Chinese, so that helped in a lot of situations. But a lot of them said no, and the conversation you could overhear was, foreigners, they're all loud, they're all dirty, they're all... So again, not a welcoming scene. You're gonna have trouble with these things, and you've got to know someone that can introduce you and be like, no, he's not one of those people. He's the good one. In the end, if you want to live in Japan, come on over. It's a great country, and I think that's obvious from this video, because all the negative things I've said, I still live here. I took out a 10-year loan on a bike which means I'll be here at least long enough to pay it off. You know, I don't have this immediacy of leaving. There are times, but then I meet some Americans and remember why I left. Or I meet some Europeans and, you know, it's very happy, it's very positive, but then they remind me why they left Europe. It's like, oh yeah, you do have crazy taxes. Oh yeah, you can't do a lot of things because of regulation. And for the most part, there are things that most people wouldn't do anyways. If you want to get an off-road bike, there's not many places in Europe you can actually go that are not designated. Japan has gray areas. It's not as Wild West as the States. But, you know, Japan has a lot of amazing things. I wouldn't be here if it didn't. You know, as I've explained in this video, I speak 3 languages. I have an American passport. I have friends all over the world. I can make my way to where I want to be. You know, Japan's not perfect. And these anime fans or these foreigners who have been beaten down by the system who want to pretend it is, are really hurting themselves and hurting all the foreigners of the future. One last little note I want to make, the effect of Corona on all this. Now I know millions are dead because of Corona, and I know it's been a terrible thing, but for me there has been a huge silver lining, and I want to talk about that real quick. The borders are shut, and Japan didn't have a bad Corona situation in general, but with the borders being shut, there were no tourists. And since there were no tourists, everyone who looked at me assumed I lived here, assumed I belonged here, and most assumed I spoke Japanese. It was a night and day difference that suddenly I do belong here to some extent. I'm obviously still not Japanese, but I am finally an immigrant. And it just became more collective. People started helping each other a bit more, even if you weren't Japanese. You were more included in many things. And I'm a bit worried because the Olympics will have started by time this video comes up. And Jesus Christ Superstar is a Broadway musical that's opening in Tokyo sometime soon. It's always on the radio advertising in English. So tourism is slowly coming back. New foreigners are slowly coming back. Non-Japanese speaking foreigners are slowly going to increase again. So I'm wondering, is my quality of life going to plummet again back to the days when it was like, I think I want to leave? As the vaccine finally rolls out here in Japan and tourism picks back up, over the next 4 or 5 months, I think it's going to decide for sure, will I stay in Japan or is it time to go? Because now my Japanese is pretty good, close to fluent. If people stop speaking Japanese to me again for simple things, it's time to learn German. But as always, thanks for watching. This has been Kairyu Rider.